Today, I'm really excited to have Tomer Dean on the podcast. Tomer is the co-founder and CEO of AudioLabs, a new generative AI company that allows podcasters to easily create video content for social media. Prior to AudioLabs, Tomer has worked on a bunch of different startups in the past, such as Blush, which was a targeting online stores, and Doggy Finder, which helped dog owners keep track of their dogs. Tomer has also been named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 and is also a fellow podcaster. It's exciting to have Tomer on the podcast because as someone who does the same thing as what Audiolabs is addressing, which is breaking my podcast down to short form video content, it'd be great to see a solution that does that a lot easier. And so for me, the problem that this company is solving hits pretty close to home. With that said, I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, Tomer, and welcome onto the podcast.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have you on and talk about Audio Labs. But before we get into that, I'd love to get into your story first. So the question I usually ask everyone when they come onto the podcast, and I'll ask you is, what first got you into entrepreneurship? What got you down this route?
Pokemon cards.
Oh wow,
So that
okay,
was so selling Pokemon cards was my first real venture, and it happened when I was 8 years old. I grew up in San Jose, California, and Pokemon cards were all the rave. And this was back when they just came out, so it must be mid '90s.
okay,
And our parents would all give us, $10 a week, go buy some cards at a store, and we would collect like hundreds of these cards, and we didn't really play with them. We were just collecting them. And eventually I started seeing that these cards were worth something because the newer versions, we had the first editions, the second edition and third edition were coming out. So I kind of understood that what we had was a better version. So I started buying these Pokemon cards from my classmates for like $1 or 50 cents and selling it to like the sixth graders for like at 5x, 10x profit.
oh wow, okay, yeah. So that's like, I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs have, or a lot of them have this childhood story about how they got started with a lemonade stand, or in your case, a Pokemon card. So, okay, so you started selling Pokemon cards. I assumed you liked, the business aspect and growing that a little bit. So, like, what? How did that translate later into later life?
Yeah, so the Pokemon card was a great start. I got some seed funding to buy a Nintendo 64 and some other shit that kids buy, I guess.
Right.
And I started getting into a bit more into the entrepreneur world when kind of the rise of the internet. So it was in the late '90s. That was the days of the forums and kind of really light coding,
Hmm.
kind of the PHP days. And I taught myself how to program websites at first, and started getting into building websites, buying websites, selling websites. So I had a good run there for a few years. Even made quite a bit of money for a 14, 15-year-old kid.
Hmm.
Yeah, great times.
Right. And so, so like you mentioned, you got it familiar with coding, and then, you learn PHP and all these different frameworks. So, and then ultimately you start studying them. So then what ended up happening when you turned 18, decided to, from high school, decided to go on to what's next, university or something like that.
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Israel. So here,
Hmm.
after high school, you join the military. So
Okay.
I did a 5 year stint in the military, but I was lucky to get a great job as a software developer
Hmm.
during those years. So those were kind of my more professional years that I learned kind of the craft more professionally, how to work within a team, and deadlines, and how do you work with a client on the other side you have to deliver for, and more enterprise software use cases. And after that finished, I was ready to go back to kind of the real world in my eyes of, all right, let's get
Right.
back to business. Let's start building things that people
Hmm.
need, and
Hmm.
yeah, and making money in the same time is always fun as well.
Right. So, you decided to get back into the real world. So what was your first venture into that?
So after the army, I opened a startup with my with two of my good friends during
Hmm.
college, and we ended up selling this company actually, which I was really surprised that we found the buyer. But it was a pretty cool, really light SaaS app that helped you
Hmm.
track where your dog is if he gets lost. And it was kind of something we just did kind of on the side hustle, a side
Right.
startup. But it worked pretty well, and that was our first acquisition, kind of in our junior year.
Hmm. Hmm. And then eventually, so you sold the startup, and then what eventually led you to Audio Labs today? Like, what's the story to get you today?
Yeah, so it all started when, do you remember Clubhouse?
Yeah.
All right. So this was back in the Clubhouse days. I was
Hmm.
in a Clubhouse room listening to Ryan Hoover from Product Hunt talk
Right.
about the latest trends that he's seeing. And one
Hmm.
of the things he mentioned is that it could be interesting to start building tools and solutions for audio creators.
Right.
So obviously the Clubhouse route didn't really pan out, but his point on the creator technology was compelling. And from that discussion that I listened to, I got together with me and my two friends, and we said, listen, let's let's actually build something. And
Right.
we launched a really small MVP a few weeks later, which
Hmm.
eventually turned into what today is Audio Labs.
Right.
And so it was kind of a mix of natural curiosity and kind of
Right.
validating this new direction that was presented to us.
Right.
And then we kind of evolved, did a few pivots, and today it's Audio Labs as we'll talk about in a moment.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really interesting how you talk about, like, how Ryan Hoover was saying that it's a good time to make different tools for audio content creators, because I think especially in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen podcasts and just audio form,
Mm.
conversational based media really skyrocket. And even from the time I started, like, my original podcast was 2019 to today, I've seen it exponentially grow in terms of the amount of people who want to listen to this type of stuff. And I mean, Clubhouse is a great validation of that in the middle of the pandemic, right? And now Twitter Spaces is sort of the natural continuation of that. So it's really interesting. Okay. And I think, before we get into Audio Labs, I think one thing that I found really interesting is how, you worked on a lot of different stuff before. So, you're talking about, at the beginning, of course, with Pokemon cards, and that was your interest there. And naturally, that evolved into all the different businesses you started, and the dog app, and now to the Audio Lab. So I was just wondering, like, when it comes to choosing what you do next, what is your, like, thought process? Like, how do you determine that, hey, this is what I want to work on?
The best businesses I've started were they started naturally. I just had a
Hmm.
little kind of something, kind of had a little light turn on in my head, and I just kind of went for it. Didn't consult too
Right.
much, didn't ask around, didn't do too much research. Kind of went for it. Um,
Hmm.
so that is one way. I don't always recommend it. Depends what you're trying to
Hmm.
build. So it's a mix of that, kind of being always being naturally curious, understanding why things are happening. And I think in the last few years, so much has changed in the world that you can get so many great ideas just by looking at these changes and how these changes will have a ripple effect and change the way we consume and the way we create, and what problems are we going to have tomorrow. And
Right.
that's kind of my framework, which I think is my best practice, even though I don't always implement it. I think being very curious naturally is important. Being able
Hmm.
to validate something quickly, and a strong bias for action. I think those are kind of
Hmm.
three traits which I'm pretty good at, which I think help me become a good entrepreneur.
Right. And I think one other thing that was really interesting is that, a lot of people, they briefly try the corporate route, or they get, look, let's be honest, like, in the startup world, of course, it can become very lucrative. But I personally don't think, like, money should be the motivating factor if you go into a startup, because it's such a low probability. Like, there should be some other passion or some other reason there. So I feel like a lot of people go to the corporate route because it is very lucrative. So I was just wondering, like, in your opinion, like, or in your experience, you strictly stuck to startups. So why not go the corporate route given your experience?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I did a few interesting offers over the past few years. In the end, I think it's about knowing who you are. I'm someone
Hmm.
that's very restless. Um, I'm always trying new things. I have issues kind of going into patterns. I have issues following orders from someone I don't respect. And to be
Hmm.
honest, I wouldn't be a great employee to manage. And you can ask
Right.
my previous managers, I was a nightmare when I
Right.
had an issue. So I think that's a part of who I am. I think being constrained to a certain title, responsibilities, um, or even within the organization is very challenging for me. And today I have
Hmm.
gone better at it, but it's something that as long as I can keep on working with people I like working, and that's why I think entrepreneurship is the right route for me. But it's very
Right.
individual.
Right. Right. That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much for that, brief introduction. So, let's get on to Audio Labs. So, just to give our viewers a little bit more context, Audio Labs is a platform that easily allows podcasters to transform their podcast into short form content for social media. And you're already working with some of the top podcasts out there, and I'll throw a link in the bio if anybody wants to check it out. But it's really interesting stuff, and I think especially with the new wave of AI APIs and just platforms that are coming out, we really see a lot of different platforms that are targeted towards content creators. So it's really interesting to see how this one's towards podcasts, because I know something that I do personally is break my podcast down into short form to get viral reach. So definitely, like, not only is this idea pertinent to a lot of group of people, for me personally it's also very pertinent. So that's why it's a very, like, when I saw it I was like, wow, this is really great. So I think you already talked about some of the motivation behind creating it with Ryan Hoover's story and Product Hunt. But when you started doing a little bit more research, because I guess Ryan said just strictly audio tools, but like when you started doing more research, like what did you find out about this problem in the space, and what were some of the different ideas or the different concepts that you decided to incorporate into this idea?
Yeah, so right now looking at the whole kind of ideation process, it might seem very apparent and transparent, but back when we started this thing last year, the whole short
Hmm.
form video space was much less mature than it is right now.
Hmm.
And we were actually focused on a whole different set of problems. We were still helping audio creators get more reach, but video was not a very strong initiative back then. And we were looking at kind of
Hmm.
other things we can do. And it was around taking live audio content and repurposing it into different formats, like making it as a publishing Twitter Spaces as a podcast.
Right.
And only in the last few months, I think we made this change 4 months ago. We understood that short form is the future, and
Right.
not TikTok pioneered it, but YouTube, Instagram, Facebook are already active, and there's a good chance that Twitter, LinkedIn, and Spotify will add their own short form videos soon. So it's going to be a very
Hmm.
prominent format going forward. And I tried this. The whole idea started with my own podcast, my own Twitter Spaces. I
Right.
want to repurpose, right, the same way as you do to get more reach, and I started creating these videos on Veed IO, which is a video creation platform, and the videos were awesome and they performed very well. It just took me a few hours, and I was far from
Right.
an excellent editor back then, at least, and they weren't as professional as I would want them. And then me and my founder said, listen, we can kind of change what we're working on, and we can build the world's first scalable clip generator specifically
Right.
for podcasting. And
Hmm.
that kind of went together with our change to a more B2B audience, and it was a
Hmm.
great shift. And I think even today, and probably also in the next few years, short form clips will be one of the best ways you can get reach, because
Right.
podcasting is very hard to discover. It remains one of the biggest issues.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I guess, talking a little bit more about the technologies behind it. So, of course, generative AI is a huge component of that. being able to find, break down the podcast into shorter like waveforms, and make sure that you are optimizing it to be viral, or to be a good piece of content to put on social media. So I was just wondering, like, you mentioned, like, you spend the whole time editing before a couple hours, and you can completely break that down into a much easier process that should be completed in a matter of minutes. But I think one of the issues that a lot of people have with generative AI is that they feel like that when we when we allow AI to create content for us, we might lose that human aspect. We might lose that, because we're just going to be optimizing for viral growth. We might lose those small, or that control over your content. So I
Mm.
was just wondering, like, with your platform today, how do you ensure that podcasters have the convenience of getting an optimized piece of content quickly, but at the same time have enough control so that piece of content is actually theirs? It's just not just the AI's, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yeah. So I think let's put this into two. I think there's two issues here that's going on.
Mhm.
One is that a creator or anyone publishing content wants to that content represents them, their vibe, their style,
Mhm.
their brand voice. That's the first thing. I think that's super important, and I completely understand. I think the more we go in B2B, the more this will be important. And the second thing
Mhm.
is, um, how do we find the right moments? And should AI be a completely automatic solution, or should it be assistive? And the two answers here is, I'll start with the end. I don't see AI as some automated bot that takes all of our content automatically, finds, chops it up, creates videos, publishes it. That's not how I see the
Right.
future. Um, one is all for a few reasons. One is it's very hard to get to the level where anything the AI will do will be high quality enough so you can publish. And the second thing is that I don't think it's necessary. I think is what we need is a
Right.
tool that'll help us do the job in 5 minutes with minimal input, but enough that the human, right, us as the humans, we control the narrative and the storytelling
Right.
aspect, and we use AI to make us more efficient. And as you mentioned, generative AI is one of the few technologies in the last few years that has taken civilization and technology 10x faster, better, cheaper.
Right.
And we've seen that we can automate around 95% of the video production process, once we have trained enough examples with the model, and we the platform's still a bit more mature. We're not there yet, but we're hoping to reach
Mhm.
that point by the end of the year.
Right. And I think one of the things that I personally believe, of course, I might be wrong on this, is I do think, especially with the humanities and arts, the human will always be in the loop to some degree, because I feel like if we just have completely AI generated content, we're sort of missing the point in a way. I might be completely wrong on that maybe 10 years in the line we're only having AI generated content with no humans, but I just feel like, especially with something like art, you're gonna have to have a human at all times. So I think that's one thing people miss. Um, but yeah, I think, like, the platforms that will succeed personally, personally, I feel like the platforms that will succeed with generative AI are the ones that enable creators to have their own imprint, like you mentioned there, at the same time with that convenience. It won't just be an completely automated process per se. It'll just be a much
Yeah.
more optimized
So
process.
actually, I have a story to your second point here. I remember a few months ago we were
Hmm.
talking with our first design partners for this podcast to TikTok product, and they loved the fact that they can get these videos ready. So they asked for a few demos, and this was a big account. We were very excited.
Right.
So we created a few demos for them. We come to the offices to kind of give them the pitch. They see the demos, and they were excited. And then they asked us if they can share it with the team, with the kind of the expanded team. And the feedback they got
Hmm.
was, it's not our brand voice, it's not our style. There were too many stock
Right.
photos and stock videos and kind of generic looking visuals, and just wasn't good enough. And while it
Mm-hmm.
sucked that we lost that contract, it did make us kind of double down and understand how do we make these videos personalized for every customer by learning their
Right.
brand voice, even well beyond font colors and sizes and logos, but understanding which moments does this brand use humor in these clips, they use memes, what's their kind of their
Right.
vibe. And today that's baked into the product. And we also have
Mm-hmm.
every customer can define their brand voice, and over time it also evolves and
Mm-hmm.
learns more which segments to use.
Right. Right. That makes sense. Yeah, and that's exactly it, right? Like it might be like I'm sure the clip you give it might be super optimized for growth and for viral for like to become viral, but that's not necessarily what people want. Like people also want that content to be theirs. And so it's like a balancing act there where how do you bake that into the product, and how do you make sure that there in the content you're producing for them.
I remember that's really true. I remember I asked this client, "Do you guys want to grow?" And they were like, "Of course, we want as many views as possible." Like, okay, do you guys want to
Right.
grow, or do you want to stay consistent to your brand? If this video, the one that you didn't like, if I can guarantee you, I'll get you 1 million views, would you post it? And they're like looking at each other, like, no, I can't. So yeah, in the end,
Wow.
in terms of quality versus on brand is gonna win, and that took me a while to
Right.
understand. But yeah, I think that's really important that we want to make sure that it's yeah, it's in our voice.
Right, right. And then so talking about the product a little bit, I think one of the most important things with short form content is just getting a good hook.
Mm.
And I think within a podcast, you'll find several moments where there is a really good hook that can become viral. So I was just wondering, like, how do you guide the AI in order to find these moments? Because it can be a little bit challenging, right? There can be multiple moments. I mean, how does the AI know that?
Well, that's probably the largest question that we ask ourselves every single day, right? We're always testing
Right.
new methods of identifying hooks. I agree. That's like
Hmm.
probably 90% of the success of any short form clip will be the hook. And people are surprised when I say
Right.
this, that they usually assume it's going to be the video, the quality, whatever, but it's the hook. If you have a great hook,
Yeah.
almost any visual would succeed. If you have a bad hook, doesn't matter how good your video is in terms of quality, it won't take off. And in the
Right.
beginning, we had a very rough guidelines. And today it's a bit more advanced, but I'll kind of share what we did in the beginning. And so we noticed there's 3 categories of successful hooks, especially kind of in the tech world where most of our clients work. For example, 20 VC, we work with Harry Stebbings and his team, and they're one of the kind of the OGs on the VC TikTok world.
Yeah.
And I've seen, videos from the same episode. One gets 10,000, one gets 2.3 million. And before seeing
Hmm.
the results, I wouldn't guess which one would be the most successful one. So it's still, very much an art as a science. And but what we're seeing, there's a few different categories, and this applies, I think, mostly for tech, VC, startup world. Anything relating to money is usually a big hit. Someone raises a round, someone
Yeah.
sells, someone buys. Anything with large sums of money, anything mentioning someone prominent, a company that everyone knows, a person that everybody knows, a personal story often does a lot. So anything that invokes one of the 6 common emotions, where I would say probably fear is the number one, but happiness, there's
Right.
a lot, anxiety could also be something, kind of even some cringe clips could succeed. And the last category is any topics that touch something that's topical at the moment. So let's say, I don't know, 2 months ago it would
Hmm.
be Elon Musk on Twitter, and then the whole crypto crash, and there's always something going on. And if you can tune into making
Right.
clips from those specific kind of scenes, then that will also give you a leg up.
Right. Yeah, and I think definitely like when you mentioned there, It's definitely, there's different. It's definitely still an art. Like there's different things you can harp on, but I know for myself, there's been some times where like when I make short form content. There's been some hooks I think should have gone
Mm.
very viral, and I just got it didn't. And then some of the other ones where it's like I don't know how this one's going to perform, and it performed much better than my expectations.
So what?
So that's definitely like a science
Yeah.
I think you learn after a
So
while. But
what's your strategy on finding hooks? I'm curious.
yeah, I think it's a lot of what you were saying there. Like of course, situational. I think the money thing's a big thing as well. I I think it's also something like during the podcast for myself, I reach moments sometimes in the podcast where you know I get super excited and I
Mm.
get like
Your tone of voice.
I get sort of a little bit mind blown in the middle of the podcast. So those are typically really good moments that I'll refer back to because I'll be like, okay, if I felt those emotions, if I can edit this correctly, I think I can invoke those emotions with other people as well who are like minded. So that's a really good one for me too. But yeah, I don't know. It's like it's still something I'm trying to learn because it was the first time I really got into short form content as well because I recognize the necessity of it. But of course, like it's a science I'm gonna have to learn.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard to tell in the beginning, because in the end, people always say, what the algorithm is going to choose and preference, but in the end, it's people, right? If people like it, more people are going to see it. The algorithm ranks it higher. So in the end, you're trying to convince people, and the issue is also 30 seconds or 60 seconds or 2 minutes. It's not always enough to provide the context of the whole conversation. So you also have to look
Right.
at what clips, what segments from this 1 hour podcast can identify as interesting. They're self contained enough that you can kind of take them out of the whole context and it'll still be understandable. And you can create an interactive and engaging video clip from it, right? Just some topics are very hard
Right.
to make interesting. I think when you find those three and you
Right.
find a strategy that works well and consistently brings you good results, you're unstoppable. And we're seeing that also with some of our
Right. And
clients. They're just killing it.
and finding those threes for me can take a very long time because when you have a 45-minute to an hour podcast and you're just scrolling and you're like, okay, can this work, can this not work, that can take so long, which is why I got really curious, like how does the AI find those so quickly and and I'll start creating clips
Yeah.
around it.
So before we launched the full product, we were actually doing it manually. So we know quite well
Mhm.
how long it takes. I remember when we broke it down to the 3 stages. The first was finding clips. The second was actually creating the videos, and the third was QA and making sure there's no issues. So just creating the clips would take
Right.
around 2 hours, right, for a 45-minute podcast. So that's 3x the length. Then creating clips would take maybe 4 hours of a professional doing it, maybe even a bit more. And
Right.
then the last part will also take, let's say, half an hour to fix some things. So yeah, it's an extensive process. Um, so how it works today is we still have these three frameworks, these 3 steps. So the first thing we do is we look for hooks, and we take the
Right.
audio file from the podcast, we transcribe it, we load it into our software, which is based on GPT-3, and it's trained to
Hmm.
look for segments of the podcast that have a high likelihood of going viral. And it's not straight up just wrapped on GPT. We've also trained our own internal model that knows how to identify videos that will be successful according to past videos that have been successful. So we've loaded up
Hmm.
the best hooks we found for some podcasting categories. And over time, this model is getting better at finding the right moments, and that saves a lot of time.
Right. Right. That makes sense. And I think yeah, having those two models, like both like specific model that you have, internally, and then the GPT-3 working together can definitely bring a lot more value to people because I think a lot of the companies I've seen, a lot of companies I've seen have just strictly used GPT-3, But I think what they're missing is that if you're like focusing on a specific use case, you should also have another model that is focused on that use case, and both of them together can be a lot more powerful than just having GPT-3 doing everything. So that makes a
Yeah,
lot
I
of
mean,
sense.
the GPT-3, the main component there that helps with trends is key points, as they call it. And it's a
Hmm.
summarization tool. So they know how to kind of summarize and look for things that the summary makes sense. Um, it's trained on
Right.
the bad examples as well, right? So it doesn't know what's a
Hmm.
successful TikTok clip, right? So we're looking for something that will do well on video. So it's a really unique ask that we're asking it to do. It's not just find something that's engaging, but
Right.
has a few characteristics. So we found much better results by training our own model, and that's also a way that we can
Right.
make sure this model improves over time by giving it good inputs. I think I
Hmm.
also I strongly believe, the startups that are building in the generative AI space need to focus on defensible technology, right? Because if your competitors have
Right.
access to the same frameworks and they can do the same, pretty much the same wrappings, then you don't have much of a moat, and so that's also helping.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so let's actually talk about those generative AI startups, because I think that's a really
Yeah.
interesting phenomenon. And I think, I think right now, as you mentioned, sort of generative AI is really the hype and the big craze right now. And I sort of see it sort of as like
Mhm.
crypto back in the day, where when crypto was going crazy, everybody was making a new crypto company, or making their own coin, or DAO or whatever. And of course, it's come down ever since the drop off in crypto. But I think, with that whole phase, there's definitely a lot of great companies that came out, a lot of innovative ones, but there were also a lot of companies that were just trying to buy into the hype, and pretty much to see what sticks onto the wall, right? And see like what, just try to get funding for honestly some pretty not great ideas or
Mhm.
garbage ideas. So, with the current hype in generative AI, I see it somewhat similar, where there's a lot of great companies coming out, but there's also a lot of companies that are just trying to cash in on the hype. And I think like what we see in crypto today is the companies that are sticking around now after the drop off are the ones that actually had promising, innovative ideas, and a lot of them are infrastructure companies with that. So I was just wondering, like, in your eyes, eventually once this generative AI phase, the hype phase sort of ends, what are the companies that are going to stick around in the generative AI space, based on what you think?
Yeah, so I think the generative AI space has similarities. I agree. I think there's a lot of
Mhm.
easy wins that many people went for. For example, all of those generative AI
Mhm.
avatar companies that were kind of November, December, um, even now to an extent, are still active, and some made a lot of money. Right? I think Lensa made around $50 million. At a point, they were making $1 million or $2 a day from just selling these avatars. So a lot of people made money, and a lot of people will likely still make money. I think what we're going to see is a lot of commoditization. We're going to see a lot of copycats, a lot of duplicates for the easy use cases, and which will drive down the price, and these companies will have a hard time, succeeding. I think a lot of novelties will evaporate, and I think the ones that will stick
Right.
around are the companies that can offer a real solution, so usually a business use case that they drive down the price of
Mhm.
something, they make something more efficient, they enable something new that couldn't happen, and they drive true value to their end users. And in this
Right.
subset of companies, I think they will also need defendable IP. I think making sure that you're not
Mhm.
only just relying on the same frameworks as your competitors, you have some kind of innovation. Either you have a specified AI model that does one use case better than the generic ones, or maybe perhaps you trained a hyper local model, taking the customer data or user data to
Right.
create something new, or kind of another infrastructure piece. So I think it's important to understand what you are and where you're going to compete and where you're not going to compete. I think that's the real kind of skill
Mhm.
here. Um, and maybe one more thing I'll say is that I think a lot of people are going for the very obvious use cases, the text writing. I think there's a lot of really interesting use cases which kind of are still on the horizon. For example, how do we use generative
Right.
AI for medical purposes? And a lot of other things which
Right.
aren't just related to generating graphics or even videos, but have a whole kind of subset of value.
Right. Right. Yeah, for sure. I think sort of going along those lines, I think like I think AI art and text are really in the hype right now, but a lot of the companies I've seen are pretty much just querying the API and making a UI for it, right? So I'm sure one of them out of those companies will pan out, or a few of them will, but it's going to become such a competitive space that I don't really see. I see a lot of companies in that
Yes.
sphere dying, but I think, like you mentioned there, like the use cases of generative AI that aren't necessarily the traditional ones that we've seen already in the last couple of months, or in industry or non-traditional industries that aren't necessarily, uh, you know, tech, that has a lot of potential as well that a lot of people aren't looking
Yeah.
into. So
Yeah.
definitely, I
And I
think
think
it's
that's
gonna be really
also
interesting.
important to mention. The CEO of Jasper, one of the hottest successes in generative AI, recently posted, "Your customers don't know what GPT-3 is. They don't care. What they care is getting a solution to their problem."
Yeah,
So while in the tech world it seems fairly obvious how to take these technologies, write a little wrapper on it, and it is in a sense, there can still be a lot of value you can drive just by doing pretty elementary things within the GPT-3 that
right.
it will take the average consumer maybe years to access without helping them.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think actually we see the same thing with, like, that's one of my biggest gripes with Web3 and crypto is that a lot of the companies there were like, oh, it's just a Web3 version of Instagram. It's a Web3 version of Twitter. And I'm like, that's great, but you're not innovating on any other front. You're just trying to get people onto your platform because it's Web3, but there's only like a very small subsect of the population that will actually join your platform just strictly based on that reason. But if your UI is garbage and your experience is garbage compared to what's currently there, 99% of people aren't going to join your platform. So I think that's really well said. That people won't know what GPT-3 is, but if you tell people like me, like a podcaster, that hey, I can take your editing flow from a couple hours to a couple minutes, that is a
Exactly.
much more appealing product because it's a really great solution to my problem versus you telling me that hey, I can use GPT-3 in order to, yeah, I have a GPT-3 podcast
Yeah,
editor, for example.
exactly. Because people don't care about the product too much. People want a outcome to their problem. They want a
Mhm.
solution. They want to save time. They want less headaches. They want to be loved. They want more money. So it's not. It's very rare that you
Yeah,
get people excited about just the technology without any benefits. I think that's a lot of what Web3 was. People were excited about this
mhm.
movement, and of course, there's real value in some of these products, but a lot of it was just kind of riding on belief, and this is the way the world should work, right? Where everything is blockchain and digitalized.
Right,
I think without having a real deep pain point, it's hard to implement some of these things. And generative AI it's
right.
already disrupting so many things, and it's just getting started. I remember I saw this really sad LinkedIn message that a artist was fired from his job. Not only that, they told him that they had to cut his budget, and now they're going to continue using AI to finish the artwork that he started. And they even said, "We're going to send you the
Oh,
final version so you can see what we replaced you with." They thought they were doing him a favor. So it's going to have a lot of impacts,
wow.
and I think that's okay. I think it's part of evolution. It's part of um, taking the next step forward. And I don't think you're going to be replaced with AI. I think you're going to be replaced by a human that's using AI.
Right. Yeah, no, that's definitely going to become I think like for bigger artists will survive because I think people will just naturally pay extra money for their art just for that human aspect. But the smaller artists who are just commissioned to make art pieces, they're going to go through a tough time. And I think it's funny because for the last 10 years I've been hearing about how automation, they'll get rid of jobs for factory workers, they'll get rid of jobs for with full self driving for truck drivers. But seemingly out of nowhere in the last 6 months, artists are now in that camp now as well. And I don't think any of them were expecting that this quickly, because I don't think most of them are seeing GPT-3 on the horizon there. So yeah, it's really interesting to see, and it's gonna be it's a conversation that we've been having for a long time now, but it's gonna be really interesting to see how humans in these spaces evolve from their current jobs and their current work.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think it still is one step forward and sorry, one step backwards and two step forward.
Yeah.
I think it's going to take us to good places. I think people should naturally evolve to, positions that humans can do better.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So let's talk a little bit more about AudioLab specifically. So, of course, growth is an essential part of any company succeeding, and I feel like AudioLabs, now that you've got the MVP, you've signed some initial contracts, it feels like you're in that rapid growth phase now, where you're trying to onboard clients onto your products. So, I was just thinking, like, when it comes to your thoughts, I guess, starting off, when it comes to your thoughts about growth, what is your approach to it, and what are some of the ideas that you have in terms of growth?
Yeah, so I'm one that's really careful before just focusing on growth. I
Mhm,
think finding product market fit is the goal of any pre-seed seed company,
mhm,
and it takes as long as it takes. And once you found it, usually you can tell pretty quickly. And the stage that we're at right now, I would say that we're 2 months into a growth spurt. I don't want to jinx it and say it's completely PMF, but I think we're pretty close.
mhm.
And what's important now is learnings. So it's easy to kind of say that let's just make as much money as possible, and while we still you know are looking to make a lot of revenue, it's important for us to understand why now we're not making more. How we
Right,
make this product a good product to an amazing product.
right.
And we definitely have other things we can do to prove. So optimizing on learning is my key focus here. That means working closely with our first 100 customers.
Mhm,
And today I'm doing all of the sales. So I'm personally talking to everyone,
right,
and I have half of my customers on my WhatsApp and iMessage, and we're in constant communication, and I know exactly when someone's pissed because something isn't working, or
right.
he's anxious because he's not sure, or he's really happy. So I'm kind of keeping tabs on all these customers, and me and my co-founders are synchronizing on a daily basis to see how we overcome these things and
Mhm,
just get 100 customers to delighted
mhm.
status, which is very difficult. Um, so that's where we are. We're still making the product perfect, and we're also doing some light experimentation on distribution channels.
Right,
Right, where are the next customers going to come from?
right.
What channels should we focus on? And especially in the next 2 years, the last few years were more focused on just growing, growing, growing. We
Mhm,
are indeed seeing the value of getting to profitability. I think the less reliant you can be on external funds, the more stable you're going to be, and the more likely you also attract external funds to give you
right.
even additional boosts. Investors today are afraid. They're
Mhm,
afraid of writing a check and having you run out of money in a year or 6 months, and them having to keep on bankrolling you, or to write off their investments. So I think showing that you can stay afloat, even without external capital, is a very good position to be in.
right.
Not all companies can do this, but we're in the lucky position that we're pretty close to that point.
Mhm,
So we're definitely taking a different strategy than what I would have taken a year or two ago.
right. Right. That makes sense. And I think, especially with the audience you're targeting here, like, let's put investors to the side, but just for the growth of the product, I feel like podcasting is a pretty tight knit community, actually. So I think just even word of mouth marketing, if do a great job for those first 100 clients that are in the podcast market, I do really feel like you'll see some natural growth just there, just based on word of mouth and people seeing that value and talking to people and other people in the community as well. So definitely, that's a really interesting. I think that's a great approach, and it's very interesting to see, the way you guys are approaching this.
Yeah, it's also important to there's one thing that I really want to start focusing on in the next few months, in the
Yeah.
next few weeks. If we're going to talk maybe some initiatives, right? Is TikTok, right?
Hmm.
We need to be doing more TikTok. We're a company that's actually promoting the use of TikTok, and our TikTok channel isn't doing well enough.
Right.
We just haven't had time to be focusing on ourselves.
Right.
And initiative that I'm pushing out now is one to get all of our podcast clips on. First of all, get all of our clips on TikTok and get back to the podcast, because for the past 2 months we were so busy just working with all these new clients that we didn't have time to record episodes ourselves,
Right.
which is a shame. I'm embarrassed. Um, so we're doing a session on Tuesday,
Hmm.
and everything's going to be repurposed on all platforms as
Right.
it should. Right, it's the right strategy. And another really interesting initiative that I'm kind of spearheading is we have an internal guide that we use with how to find hooks, how to make videos, and kind of the best practices that some of them we've baked into our products, and we're publishing this.
Hmm.
And it took us a while to think about, should we publish it or is it a trade secret? And we decided that we're going to publish it all. And I think this is something I'm really excited about. And the reason I'm excited about it is that, sharing our best techniques and all our tricks
Right.
is really scary on the one hand, but I have a great feeling that it's going to provide so much value to readers and will also result in a lot of new clients for us.
Right.
Because I think if someone took a look at this guide, they'd be like, oh shit, I don't have time to do all that.
Right.
I'm just going to pay these guys to do it for me.
Right. That makes sense. And I think, I think, whether it be, podcasters, or, your clients, or it be investors, one of the first questions that people ask is, why are you the right people for the job? And so if you can showcase your value, whether it be in your own podcast, showing, your own viral clips, or in this guide, even like if you put out a guide showcasing how to, the strategies for making clips, people, you instantly get this recognition or this reputation that, hey, these people know what they're doing clearly, and you showcase your value to investors and to other prospective clients. So definitely, I think that's a great strategy, and I think it should be pretty successful.
I, yeah, I was actually basing this strategy on this. There's this guy I know that he runs external SDR teams, right?
Okay.
So he's one of the best SDRs in the world, and he was referred to me by a friend a few years ago because I was having some problem with our sales, and I get on a call with this guy, and this guy is extremely smart, and he starts talking to me about sales and SDRs and account executives and closing, and then he was started talking about how his strategy works, and he was basically pitching me his services as an agency, and he started getting to very very detailed. He was sharing his screen, and he was sharing everything, his secrets. He was opening like excels and showing me the numbers of different clients. The names were blacked out, but I can see it was real data, and
Right.
I understood this guy's no joke. This guy's the
Yeah.
real deal. And then I was like, asked him like, why are you showing me everything? I can record this conversation. I can take screenshots. I can do it myself, and but I don't have to pay you. He wanted $100,000
Right.
retainer, and I asked him like, why are you showing me all this? Shouldn't this be your trade secret? And he's like, Tomer, listen, I know you're not going to copy it. I know you're busy. I know you don't have time to do this. You've never done this before. It'll be hell for you. I want you to try to copy this. You'll quickly fail, and then you'll remember who told you this is going to happen, and you'll come back to me.
Right.
And he was really true. I actually didn't go back to him, but I have referred many customers to him because I
Right.
really respect his strategy, and that's the same thing I'm trying to do. So if I can also offer value, teach people how it should be done, but also explain that it's very very detailed. It's very much an art and a science together. And if you're a busy executive running a podcast on the side, maybe someone like yourself, then you don't have a full-time day job to do this. You have a few
Yeah.
hours a week. That's just to record the podcast, right? All these editing things, it's in addition to your your regular jobs to be done. So
Right.
anytime you're doing this, you're not doing your more strategic things. You're not booking tier one guests or writing better questions, or maybe doing some collaborations. So
Right.
that that's our
Yeah.
strategy: providing content and value.
I love that attitude that like, hey, if you want, go ahead.
Yeah,
Because yeah, like
there it is.
most people like if they can do it, then fair enough. But like yeah, like you hit it right on the nail there. Where it's like somebody like me, I'm not gonna go out of my way to I have so many other stuff to do. So you're showing me your value. You're showing me what you know. And if I want to do it, I can, but I just don't have the time. And so I'll go for your product.
Yeah, and I also saw there's a potential today. If you Google guides to create podcast clips, you won't get any meaningful results. This is such a
Right.
new category of kind of problem and pain point where there's no real guide. There's nobody really knows how to do this except for a
Right.
very few, the 1% of content creators, right? The Gary V's and Nas Dailies, they know how to do it, but most regular people, they don't know the secrets to the best hooks.
Right. Right. That makes sense. Well, thank you so much, Tamara, for coming onto the podcast. Clearly you guys are doing some great work at AudioLabs, and I think you guys are the right people for the job. So, I'm really excited to see, your journey. But before we wrap up here, I was just wondering, there's two main questions I ask people before I let them go. So the first one being, is there a book that you recommend us reading or checking out?
There is. It's called Influence by
Mhm.
Robert Cialdini, and it talks about the 7 different methods that human beings are convinced by things. And it gets down to a really detailed but elementary level of how each one affects us, such as social proof, authority, scarcity, and has affected a lot of my thinking on the way I do business, the way I handle relationships, the way I negotiate. I think that's one of the most impactful books I've read. I've actually read it 3 times, so my book, it looks like shit. It's all kind of wrinkled, and I let it get wet in grease. But I think it's one of the books I strongly recommend.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely add that to my Goodreads because I'm on a little bit of a track right now. Like I've had a couple books recommended from other guests, so I'm slowly getting there. But definitely, if you're mentioning it's a really good one, I might have to move it up the ladder to my next read. But perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for recommending that. And then the last question I have for you before I let you go is, what are the next steps for you in Audio Labs? What can we look forward to?
So we're excited about we're just setting kind of our annual goals. We want
Mhm.
to get to 100 delighted users by the end of this year, and hit our revenue targets, which are set at 2 million ARR. And if we get to the stage, happy clients, strong revenues, um, it would also mean profitability. That would make me delighted, and that would be a great year,
Right.
at least a great
Well,
recession year.
no, well, best of luck. I think you guys are definitely poised to hopefully hit that. So, yeah, hopefully, a year from now we can have a quick call and talk about how in the podcast, you mentioned all this, and hopefully you hit those goals.
Yeah,
But yeah,
definitely.
thank you
And
so much, Tomer, for coming.
yeah,
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
definitely. And I'd love to offer you a free repurposing of this episode, so we can turn this one into some short 4 clips for you. And yeah, we'll see how it performs against the ones you create.
Perfect. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. So, I mean, listeners, if you are listening to this, hopefully those are already out. But thank you so much, Tomer, for hopping onto the podcast. Really appreciate you coming on.
All right, thanks for having me.